Welcome to Sleeping Times. Did you know that little salt shaker on your table was once as valuable as gold? That wars were fought over it, empires financed with it, and people died trying to smuggle it? While you casually add a pinch to your food without thinking twice, your ancestors crossed scorching deserts for months, carrying white crystals on their backs, considering them precious treasure. The word salary comes from salt because Roman soldiers were paid with it. Popular uprisings erupted because of salt taxes. Gandhi challenged the British Empire simply by collecting salt from the beach. How did something so common today become the silent engine that moved entire civilizations, shaped global trade routes, and determined who had power and who didn't? This transformation from precious to mundane is one of the most fascinating and untold stories of humanity. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss our next relaxing stories. Oh, and don't forget to leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see how our community is spread across the world. Now, how about turning off the lights, finding a comfortable position, and getting ready to discover how a simple, white, crystal, connected continents financed empires, caused revolutions, and is still present in practically everything around you today in ways you never imagined. Imagine for a moment that the simple act of salting your food was a luxury reserved only for the richest. Hard to imagine, isn't it? But there was a time when salt was worth as much as gold, when men crossed entire continents carrying white crystals on their backs when wars were fought for control of a salt mine. This is the story of how something so common on our tables was once the silent engine of the world economy, shaping empires, creating trade routes, and determining the fate of entire peoples. In the earliest days of humanity, when our ancestors were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, salt was already a vital necessity. Not just to enhance flavors, but for something far more fundamental: survival. The human body doesn't produce salt, and without it, our organism simply doesn't function. Muscles stop contracting properly, nerve impulses fail, water balance collapses. Our ancestors discovered this the hard way, observing that the absence of that white crystalline substance led to weakness, mental confusion, and eventually death. For millennia, nomadic tribes obtained their salt primarily through animal meat. The blood and organs of hunted animals provided the sodium needed to keep the body functioning. Herbivores, in turn, naturally sought out salt sources in nature, licking salty rocks and visiting specific mineral deposits. Humans observed these patterns and learned from them, following herds to natural salt sources, creating the first mental maps of vital resources in their territory. But everything changed when humanity decided to settle in one place. The Neolithic Revolution, about 10,000 years ago, brought agriculture and animal domestication. With a diet based mainly on grains and cultivated vegetables, poor in sodium, the need for external salt became critical. It was no longer possible to rely solely on occasional hunting. It was necessary to find, extract, and store salt systematically. And it was at that exact moment that salt began its journey as an essential commodity. The first agricultural communities established near natural salt sources had an enormous competitive advantage. Salt germ deposits, salt springs, salt lakes, or access to the sea became strategic resources. Settlements began to emerge around these sources, not by chance, but by absolute necessity. The geography of salt was beginning to draw the map of human civilization. Have you ever stopped to think about how many of the great ancient cities were founded near salt sources or trade routes for this mineral? In ancient Sumer, one of humanity's first urban civilizations, cuneiform records on clay tablets already mentioned salt more than 5,000 years ago. The Sumerians not only extracted salt from coastal marshes through solar evaporation, but developed a sophisticated trade in this resource. Temples controlled production and distribution, collecting taxes in salt. It was liquid wealth, or rather crystalline wealth. Salt had intrinsic value, standardized weight, and was universally accepted, functioning almost like a primitive currency. In ancient Egypt, salt had an even more sacred function. The Egyptians discovered that a mixture of natural salts called natron, found in dried lake beds, was perfect for the mummification process. For 70 days, the bodies of pharaohs and nobles were treated with natron, which dehydrated the tissues and prevented decomposition. Salt not only preserved food for the living, but also preserved the dead for eternity. Entire teams of specialized workers dedicated their lives to the trade and processing of this special salt, creating a funeral industry that lasted millennia. Ancient China developed salt extraction techniques that were true engineering marvels. More than 2,000 years ago, the Chinese were already drilling wells up to 1,000 meters deep using bamboo drills to reach underground brine deposits. The brine was then pumped to the surface through bamboo tubes and evaporated in large iron pans over furnaces fueled by natural gas that, coincidentally, was found alongside the salt deposits. This gas was transported for miles through ducts also made of bamboo, a true cutting-edge technology industry for the time. The sophistication of these operations was impressive. Entire dynasties based a significant portion of their revenue on salt taxes, creating strict state monopolies. Salt was so valuable that smugglers risked their lives to avoid taxes, and special patrols policed the trade routes. Control over salt production and distribution was, literally, control over the population. Without salt, an entire province could enter into crisis, and popular uprisings could erupt over abusive price increases for this essential item. In ancient Europe, the Celts were already exploiting salt mines in the Alps more than 3,000 years ago. The region of Hallstatt in present-day Austria owes its name to salt. Hall means salt in ancient Celtic. This small alpine village became so rich from salt mining that it gave its name to an entire era of the Iron Age, the Hallstatt period. Winding tunnels descended hundreds of meters into the heart of the mountains, where miners with pine torches tore blocks of rock salt from the rocky walls, working in shifts that followed the rhythm of the seasons. The mines were worlds unto themselves, with their own rules and hierarchies. The air inside the tunnels was dry and impregnated with salt particles that deposited in the workers' lungs over the years. Interestingly, this dry environment also perfectly preserved organic artifacts. Modern archaeologists found in Hallstatt clothing, wooden tools, even human feces preserved for millennia, offering a detailed portrait of the life of those ancient miners. It was hard, dangerous work, but extremely profitable for those who controlled the mines. The Roman Empire transformed salt into a matter of state. The word salary derives directly from the Latin salarium, which originally referred to the salt ration supplied to Roman soldiers, or the money given to buy salt. Roman legionaries, who marched throughout the known world conquering territories, received their payment partly in salt. It was a way to ensure that even on the most distant frontiers of the empire, where coins could be scarce, soldiers would have access to this essential commodity. Salt, therefore, literally helped build the greatest empire of the ancient world. Rome also built an extensive network of roads dedicated to salt transport. The Via Salaria, one of Rome's oldest roads, connected the salt mines on the Adriatic coast to the capital, crossing mountains and valleys. Along it, endless caravans of loaded mules transported tons of salt to supply the city of 1 million inhabitants. This road still exists today, and you can walk on the same paving stones that felt the weight of salt shipments 2,000 years ago. How many of our modern highways will be remembered 2 millennia from now? Roman salt mines were impressive industrial operations. On the Mediterranean coast, vast fields of solar evaporation extended for miles. Seawater was channeled into shallow, interconnected tanks where the hot sun and summer wind did their work slowly. As the water evaporated, the salt concentration increased until white crystals began to form at the bottom of the tanks. Workers, often slaves, harvested these crystals with special tools, stacking them in brilliant piles under the Mediterranean sun before being transported to warehouses. Control over salt gave Rome power not only militarily, but also economically and politically. Entire provinces paid tribute in salt, and the Roman state maintained strict monopoly over production and distribution. It was a revenue source so important that it financed a significant portion of public works, including aqueducts, bathhouses, and the army itself. Salt flowed like blood through the veins of the empire, feeding its continuous expansion. And when Rome began to decline, control over salt routes was one of the first things to fragment, foreshadowing the collapse of the imperial system. But the true revolution of salt was still to come, because this white and crystalline mineral was not just essential for keeping the body functioning or for adding flavor to food. Salt had an almost magical power, the ability to make time stand still. In a world without refrigeration, where meat began to rot hours after slaughter and fish became unfit for consumption in a day, salt was the only reliable barrier against hunger. And this ability to preserve food would change the course of human history in ways no one could have imagined. The discovery that salt could preserve food for months, even years, was probably one of the most important technological advances in human history, comparable to the mastery of fire. Imagine living in a world where all food is perishable, where what you don't consume today will be rotten tomorrow. Life would be a constant race against the clock, an endless search for fresh food. There would be no time to build cathedrals, write books, or contemplate the stars. Survival would consume every moment of the day. The first humans to discover the preserving properties of salt probably did so by accident. Perhaps a piece of meat fell into a natural salt deposit, or fish was forgotten near a salt spring. Weeks later, when hunger struck, someone brave tasted that strangely preserved meat and discovered it was still edible. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't rotten either. It had a different flavor, more intense, but it was nutritious and safe. That accidental discovery opened a world of possibilities. The mechanism by which salt preserves food is actually quite elegant. Bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms responsible for decomposition need water to survive and reproduce. When you cover food with salt, you create a hyperosmotic environment. The high concentration of salt outside bacterial cells pulls water from inside them through osmosis. Dehydrated, these bacteria die or enter a dormant state. It's a microscopic chemical war waged with white crystals. Salt, in essence, mummifies food at the cellular level. With this simple, yet revolutionary technology, human societies could, for the first time, accumulate significant food surpluses. A good year of fishing or hunting no longer needed to be wasted. The abundance of summer could be saved for the scarcity of winter. Coastal communities developed elaborate techniques for salting and drying fish, creating products that lasted all year. Salted cod, for example, became an international commodity that fed explorers, sailors, and entire populations far from the sea for centuries. The Vikings, those audacious navigators of northern Europe, based much of their maritime expansion on the ability to preserve food with salt. Before embarking on their long voyages across the North Atlantic, they salted fish, whale meat, seal, and other animals. These preserved foods allowed the Vikings to spend months at sea, navigating to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America centuries before Columbus. Without salt, these epic journeys would have been impossible. Salt was literally the fuel of the Viking Age. In medieval Europe, the industry of salting herring in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea became one of the most important economic activities. The Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of merchant cities, built its commercial empire largely on barrels of salted herring. Cities like Lübeck and Danzig prospered enormously, their ports teeming with activity as tons of salted fish were shipped throughout Europe. Salted herring-fed armies sustained cities through harsh winters and even helped comply with the strict fasting rules of the Catholic Church, which forbade meat but allowed fish. The salting process was almost ritualistic. Working women with skilled hands and salt-resistant cold hands cleaned, gutted, and salted thousands of fish per day. Each herring received the exact amount of salt needed, no more, no less, because excess salt was waste of an expensive resource and insufficient salt meant premature decomposition. The fish were then stacked in alternating layers with salt inside carefully constructed oak barrels. The fish juice mixed with the salt, creating a brine that penetrated deep into the flesh, ensuring complete preservation. Salted meat was also essential, especially in regions without easy access to the sea. In the interior of Europe, pig slaughter in autumn was an important community event. Families gathered to slaughter animals fattened during the summer, and immediately the preservation process began. Ham, bacon, sausages, lard, all were generously treated with salt. Every part of the animal was used and preserved. Nothing could be wasted. The amount of salted meat stored in the cellar determined whether the family would pass the winter in comfort or in hunger. But salting was not just practical, it transformed foods. Cured ham developed complex flavors, woody and sweet notes that didn't exist in fresh meat. Cheese, when salted and aged, became an explosion of umami. Bitter olives transformed into salty, succulent delicacies after months in brine. German sauerkraut, Korean kimchi, pickles of all kinds all depended on salt, not just to preserve, but to chemically and biologically transform vegetables through controlled fermentation. Salt was, therefore, not just a preservative, but a culinary artist, a transformer of flavors. Think for a moment about the concept of a pantry, a space in your home dedicated to storing food that doesn't need to be consumed immediately. That concept only exists because of salt. Without preservation methods, there would be no pantries, just today's food. The existence of preserved food surpluses freed humanity from a purely subsistence existence. It allowed specialization of labor, long-distance trade, population growth, and finally, the emergence of complex civilizations. Salt, therefore, is one of the invisible pillars under the entire structure of modern civilization. In the medieval Islamic world, sophisticated techniques for preserving food with salt were practiced extensively. Caravans crossed the Sahara, transporting enormous blocks of salt from the Tagaza mines to cities in the south, where they were exchanged for gold, ivory, and slaves. Salt was so valuable in these regions that, according to reports from Arab travelers, there were markets where salt and gold were literally traded weight for weight. 1 kilogram of salt was worth 1 kilogram of gold. It seems absurd today, but in an extremely hot climate without refrigeration, salt meant the difference between feeding a city and watching it starve. In India, the tropical climate made food preservation even more challenging. Intense heat accelerated decomposition, but it also offered an advantage: rapid evaporation. Indian coastal salt mines produced high-quality solar salt on vast scales. This salt not only fed local food preservation, but also became an important export commodity. Sea routes connected India to the Middle East, East Africa, and eventually Europe, with Indian salt being one of the most demanded products. In pre-Columbian Americas, peoples like the Maya, Inca, and Aztec also developed sophisticated salt extraction and trade operations. The Maya, for example, controlled coastal salt mines in Yucatan, evaporating seawater in shallow tanks. Caravans of Maya merchants transported salt inland, trading it for jade, quetzal feathers, cacao, and obsidian. Salt was one of the most precious items in Mesoamerican trade networks, fundamental for preserving deer meat, fish, and for producing textile dyes that required salt mordants. In feudal Japan, salt production was a refined art. Specialized families collected seawater in ceramic containers and evaporated it slowly over wood-fired furnaces, producing exceptionally pure salt crystals. This salt was not just for common consumption, but also for refined culinary preparations and for preserving foods that defined Japanese cuisine: miso, soy sauce, tsukimono, pickled vegetables, and of course umeboshi, those intensely acidic, salted plums that could last years and even decades. But all this trade and dependence on salt created vulnerabilities. Peoples without access to salt sources were at the mercy of those who controlled production. Blockades of salt routes could be weapons of war as effective as armies. During sieges of medieval cities, cutting off the salt supply was a tactic guaranteed to force surrender. Without salt, the besieged population couldn't preserve food, and hunger arrived quickly. Salt had become not just a necessity, but a geopolitical weapon. Have you ever stopped to think that we have in our kitchens, freely available, a resource that once caused wars, built empires, and defined the destiny of nations? That the little salt shaker on your table represents millennia of human labor, engineering, trade, and even bloodshed? This transformation of salt from vital strategic resource to mundane commodity is one of the great narratives of human economic history. But how exactly did that happen? How did the white gold lose its shine and become so common? The answer lies in the roots that connected continents and the innovations that forever changed the face of global trade. If you could see a temporal map of salt movement through history, you would see white rivers flowing between continents, linking coasts to interiors, connecting deserts to forests, uniting peoples separated by thousands of kilometers. Salt routes were some of humanity's first long-distance trade networks, and along these paths flowed not just a mineral, but ideas, technologies, languages, religions, and genes. Salt was the economic excuse, but the routes it created carried the very essence of human culture. One of the most extraordinary salt routes in history connected the salt mines of Tagaza in the heart of the Sahara to the rich cities of the Mali Empire in the south. Tagaza was not a place where anyone would want to live. It was literally hell on earth, a village where even the houses were built with blocks of salt because there was no other building material available. The temperature easily reached 50 degrees Celsius in the shade. Water was rarer than gold, but there, in the middle of the world's largest desert, men mined salt because there was insatiable demand to the south. The caravans that departed from Tagaza were spectacles of impressive logistical organization. Thousands of loaded camels, each carrying salt slabs weighing up to 120 kilos, traveled in coordinated formations across one of the planet's most hostile environments. The journey to Timbuktu took weeks, crossing dunes that moved like frozen waves, rocky plains that stretched to the horizon, and areas where no natural landmark guided the way, only the stars and the ancestral knowledge of Tuareg guides. These desert guides were almost mythical characters, men with skin weathered by the relentless sun, eyes trained to read the texture of sand and predict storms, memory that held the location of every well and oasis along thousands of kilometers of desert. They navigated by the stars at night and by almost imperceptible signs during the day. A specific rock formation, a particular pattern in the dunes, even the smell of air that changed subtly near a hidden water source. Getting lost in the Sahara meant certain death, and these men were the difference between fortune and disaster. When the caravans finally reached cities to the south, like Timbuktu, Djenné, or Gao, the salt was unloaded and immediately became the object of intense negotiation. Merchants from the Mali Empire, from the Songhai Kingdom, Arab and Berber traders gathered in bustling markets where salt was exchanged for gold extracted from mines in the region, elephant ivory, slaves captured in tribal wars, and other valuable products. The contrast was surreal. In the north of the Sahara, salt was common and gold rare. In the south, the situation completely reversed. The intermediary merchants who dominated both sides of this geography profited enormously. In Europe, the Roman Via Salaria was just one of many roads dedicated to salt transport. In medieval France, the gabelle, the infamous salt tax, financed much of the French monarchy and became one of the deep causes of popular resentment that would eventually explode in the French Revolution. But to understand the gabelle, we must first understand how salt circulated through medieval Europe. Rivers like the Rhône, the Loire, and the Seine became water highways for salt trade. Loaded barges descended the currents carrying tons of salt from coastal salt mines to the interior. The salt mines of Bourgneuf Bay on the Atlantic coast of France were particularly important. During the Middle Ages, they produced salt of such quality and quantity that they attracted merchants from all over Europe. Ships from the Hanseatic ports of the Baltic, from England, from the Netherlands, even from the Mediterranean, docked in Bourgneuf to load salt. The bay teemed with activity, a true medieval Manhattan of salt. The feudal lords who controlled these salt mines became fabulously wealthy, building imposing castles and living in luxury that rivaled royalty. But transporting salt was not simple. Salt is heavy, bulky, and ironically vulnerable to moisture. Wet salt loses quality, hardens, and can even partially dissolve, representing huge losses for merchants. Because of this, sophisticated packing techniques were developed. Carefully constructed oak barrels sealed with bitumen to prevent leaks, bags of tanned leather, even wooden boxes lined with wax. During sea transport, the salt cargo was protected at the bottom of the hold, covered with other merchandise to avoid contact with salt water or rain. In Asia, the Silk Road did not carry just silk, but also significant quantities of salt. Caravans departing from China crossing the Tian Shan Mountains and the deserts of Central Asia carried salt along with tea, silk, porcelain, and spices. Chinese salt, especially that extracted from deep wells in Sichuan, was considered of exceptional quality. Oasis cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv became prosperous not just as entrepôts of luxury goods, but also as essential salt markets for interior populations. Salt routes also facilitated profound cultural exchanges. Arab and Berber merchants crossing the Sahara didn't just exchange salt for gold, but also spread Islam throughout West Africa. Buddhist monasteries along the Silk Road depended on salt caravans to survive, and in return offered shelter, water, and spiritual guidance to merchants. Salt trade routes became veins through which ideas flowed as freely as merchandise. In pre-Columbian South America, the Incas built an extraordinary network of roads, the Capacñan, which connected their vast empire. Along these roads, they transported not just messages through specialized runners, the chasqui, but also essential resources including salt. The Mara salt mines in the Sacred Valley near Cusco are an impressive testament to Inca engineering. Thousands of small tanks terraced on the mountainside, fed by a natural salt spring, produce salt to this day using the same techniques from 500 years ago. The Aztecs, in turn, strictly controlled the salt trade in Mesoamerica. Lake Texcoco, where the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan stood, was partially salty, and specialized techniques were used to extract salt from its waters. But the Aztecs also imported salt from coastal regions through complex trade networks. Professional merchants called Pochteca traveled throughout the empire carrying salt and other goods. These merchants were not mere traders, they were also spies, diplomats, and intelligence collectors for the empire. In sub-Saharan Africa, peoples developed transcontinental trade routes centered on salt long before the arrival of Europeans. The kingdom of Aksum, in present-day Ethiopia, controlled routes that connected the Red Sea to the African interior, transporting salt along with incense, ivory, and gold. Further west, the Empire of Ghana and later the Empire of Mali based much of their prosperity on controlling trade routes that moved salt from the Sahara to the tropical forests to the south. Have you ever stopped to think that every grain of salt in your food has already traveled kilometers, perhaps thousands of kilometers, to reach your table? That this white crystal may have been extracted from deep mines, evaporated under the scorching sun of a desert, transported in ships across stormy oceans, processed in industrial factories, and that this journey, today so efficient and invisible, once involved epic caravans, tense negotiations in exotic markets, and fortunes gained and lost. Salt connected the world long before modern globalization, but this global salt trade would also reveal a much darker side of human nature. Every great commodity in human history carries bloodstains, and salt is no exception. Behind the romantic trade routes, the exotic caravans crossing deserts, and the fortunes built on white crystals, there exists a parallel darker story. A story of brutal exploitation, forced labor, destroyed lives, and empires built on human suffering. Salt, this simple chemical compound that makes life possible, was also an instrument of oppression and control for millennia. Salt mines have always been places of extremely hard and dangerous work. Descending hundreds of meters into the bowels of the earth, miners worked in conditions that defied the limits of human endurance. The Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, in operation since the 13th century, extends for more than 300 kilometers of galleries on 9 levels, reaching depths of 330 meters. At the height of production, thousands of men worked in endless shifts in those underground chambers, lit only by torches and later by oil lamps. The air inside the mines was paradoxically pure because of salt's antimicrobial properties, but also relentlessly dry. Breathing that air laden with salt particles for years caused chronic respiratory problems. The physical effort was exhausting. Mining rock salt meant tearing solid rock blocks using only pickaxes, shovels, and brute force. Accidents were common. Cave-ins killed workers regularly. Tools broke and injured. The near-absolute darkness, interrupted only by flickering flames, created a claustrophobic and psychologically draining environment. For centuries, much of the work in these mines was performed by prisoners, convicted criminals, or simply people in debt who couldn't pay and were forced into slave labor until they did. In imperial China, criminals were frequently sentenced to work in the salt mines of Sichuan, a sentence many considered worse than death. The mines were so deep and the work so brutal that few survived long enough to complete their sentences. They were buried alive, just more slowly than if they had been executed. The trans-Saharan salt trade, despite its economic grandeur, was intimately linked to the slave trade. The same caravans that transported salt from north to south often returned, carrying enslaved people captured in wars or raids south of the Sahara. These slaves were forced to work in the salt mines of Tagaza and other locations, in conditions few survived for more than a few years. The extreme heat, lack of water, exhausting work, and absence of any medical care transformed these mines into slow death camps. Reports from medieval Arab travelers like Ibn Battuta described Tagaza as a place of extreme desolation where slaves mined salt until they literally died of exhaustion. There was no vegetation, no animals, no source of life, only sand, rock, salt, and human suffering. Water had to be transported from distant oases at enormous cost. Food, too, was imported. Workers lived in miserable conditions, housed in structures made of salt blocks that, ironically, were the very product of their labor. In Europe, salt taxes frequently affected the poor disproportionately. The French gabelle, instituted in the 14th century and lasting until the French Revolution, was not just a tax, but a complex and oppressive system of state control. The king determined that each family had to buy a minimum amount of salt per year at artificially inflated prices. It didn't matter if you needed that amount or not, it was mandatory to buy, and the gabelle salt was often of inferior quality because the best salts were exported or reserved for the wealthy. Worse still, France was divided into zones with different tax rates. Some provinces paid astronomical amounts, while others, due to historical privileges, paid much less or nothing. This created an immense black market for salt smuggling. Smugglers, known as faux sauniers, risked their lives transporting salt from low-tax zones to high-tax zones. If caught, they faced severe punishments, confiscatory fines that destroyed families, forced labor in the royal galleys, warships powered by oars by convicts, or even death sentences. Entire families were destroyed by the gabelle. Women and children were often complicit in salt smuggling, carrying small amounts hidden under loose clothing. When captured, punishments were merciless. There are records of children being sent to cruel state orphanages, women being branded with hot iron, men being hanged publicly to serve as examples. Salt, this vital necessity, became an instrument of state terror. Can you imagine living in a world where simply obtaining salt for your family could result in the destruction of everything you love? The salt monopoly was also a weapon of colonization and imperial control. When the British colonized India, they imposed laws that prohibited Indians from producing or selling salt without a license from the colonial government. Considering that India has thousands of kilometers of coastline and a millennia-old tradition of solar salt production, this law was particularly offensive. The Salt Act of 1882 consolidated the British monopoly, allowing the Crown to profit enormously, while ordinary Indians saw their salt prices skyrocket. The response to this oppression would come decades later in the form of one of the most famous campaigns of peaceful resistance in history. Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March in 1930, Gandhi, along with tens of thousands of followers, marched 386 kilometers to the coast of the Arabian Sea, where he symbolically collected handfuls of natural salt from the beach, defying the British monopoly. This simple act of civil disobedience captured the world's imagination and galvanized the movement for Indian independence. Salt, which had been an instrument of oppression, became a symbol of resistance and freedom. The Salt March demonstrated a powerful principle. Even the most basic and seemingly mundane commodities can become battlegrounds in the struggle for justice and self-determination. Gandhi understood that attacking the salt monopoly was attacking the moral legitimacy of the British Empire. How could a government that considered itself civilized and benevolent deny a people the right to collect a naturally abundant mineral in their own land? The contradiction was unsustainable, and the international pressure that followed contributed significantly to the eventual end of British colonial rule. But exploitation linked to salt didn't end with the end of colonial empires. Even today, in some parts of the world, salt extraction occurs under questionable conditions. Workers in salt mines in developing countries often work without adequate protection under scorching sun, exposed to conditions that cause serious skin and vision problems. Payment is minimal, living conditions precarious. Children, in some regions, still work in salt mines to supplement devastatingly low family income. In contemporary India, for example, entire communities of migrant workers seasonally relocate to work in the salt mines of Gujarat during the dry season. Families live in makeshift straw huts in the middle of the salt mines, under temperatures exceeding 45 degrees Celsius. Work begins before dawn and extends until sunset. Harvesting, raking, transporting tons of salt manually. Without protective equipment, these workers' skin is constantly burned both by the sun and by salt crystals. Many develop chronic respiratory problems. And all this for wages that barely guarantee subsistence. Human rights organizations have documented cases where entire families are trapped in cycles of debt, with salt mine owners working essentially as modern serfs. They receive advances at the beginning of the season that they never fully repay, forcing them to return year after year. It's a veiled form of debt slavery that persists in the 21st century, in the invisible margins of the global economy, producing a product that all of us consume daily without questioning its origin. It's uncomfortable to think that something so omnipresent in our lives can have such dark stories associated with it. Does the salt in our salt shakers carry echoes of this suffering? As consumers at the top of the globalized supply chain, do we have some responsibility for what happens at the base of that chain? These are uncomfortable questions, but necessary ones. The history of salt reminds us that behind every seemingly innocent commodity can lie layers of ethical complexity that we prefer to ignore. But ignorance is not innocence. And understanding the complete journey of salt, including its most difficult parts, helps us appreciate not just its value, but also the real human cost of our modern conveniences. This reflection becomes even deeper when we understand how control over salt was systematically used as a tool of political power. The Industrial Revolution transformed practically every aspect of human life, and salt was no exception. For millennia, salt production had been limited by essentially primitive technologies: solar evaporation dependent on climate, labor-intensive manual mining, slow and inefficient processes. But between the 18th and 19th centuries, a wave of technological innovations began to radically transform how salt was extracted, processed, and distributed. The ultimate result would be the transformation of salt from a precious and strategically controlled commodity into a cheap and universally available product. One of the first important innovations came, curiously, from Switzerland, a landlocked country, but with rich salt germ mines in the Alps. In 1696, Swiss engineers developed techniques for dissolving underground rock salt by pumping hot water into deep salt deposits, creating concentrated brine that was then pumped to the surface and evaporated in controlled facilities. This method of solution mining was much more efficient and safer than sending men to dangerous depths with pickaxes. The technique gradually spread to other regions with rock salt deposits. The steam engine, that transformative force of the Industrial Revolution, also revolutionized salt production. Steam pumps allowed extraction of brine from previously inaccessible depths. Steam evaporation systems using large metal pans heated by furnaces fueled by coal allowed industrial-scale production independent of weather conditions. It was no longer necessary to wait for summer sun to evaporate salt. Production could occur year-round, in any climate. This dramatically increased available supply and began to pressure prices downward. In Victorian England, the salt mines of Cheshire became one of the most important production centres in the world. The region had vast rock salt deposits relatively close to the surface. With the application of industrial technology, including mechanized mining equipment, steam pumping systems, and railroads for efficient transport, Cheshire began producing millions of tons of salt annually. Cities like Northwich transformed into industrial centres dedicated almost exclusively to salt, with countless chimneys expelling smoke from processing facilities day and night. But this industrialization had environmental and social costs. Massive salt extraction frequently caused land subsidence, with entire areas sinking as salt caverns were excavated below. In Northwich, buildings regularly developed severe cracks or even collapsed completely. Some structures had to be built on floating foundations that could adjust as the ground sank. It was like living on a semi-liquid, unstable surface, constantly changing. The price of progress was, literally, having the earth move beneath your feet. Workers in industrialized mines faced new dangers. Powerful machines could crush, cut, or trap limbs in seconds of distraction. Explosions of methane gas or salt dust became more likely with larger-scale operations. Fatal accidents were surprisingly common but rarely properly recorded, especially when victims were common workers without resources to seek compensation. Salt continued to be extracted with blood, just now more efficiently and in much larger volumes. Simultaneously, innovations in transportation revolutionized salt distribution. Canals were built specifically to transport salt from mines and salt works to distant markets. The Bridgewater Canal in England, built in 1761, was one of the first modern industrial canals and was designed especially to transport coal and salt. Barges loaded with tons of salt glided smoothly through the canals, initially moved by horses and later by steamboats, drastically reducing transportation costs. What once took weeks in carts now took days on canals. The arrival of railroads completed the revolution in transportation. Train cars could carry quantities of salt that would make ancient camel caravans seem insignificant. A single train consisted of more salt than hundreds of carts, and it did so at unthinkable speeds before. What took weeks now took hours. Suddenly, salt from Cheshire mines could reach London the same day. American salt from New York mines could reach any city served by the growing national railroad network. Geography ceased to be a significant barrier. In the United States, the discovery of vast salt deposits drove the development of entire regions. The salt mines of Hutchinson, Kansas, eventually became some of the largest in the world, with underground caverns so vast that today they are used for storing everything from old Hollywood films to sensitive government documents. Detroit, once a relatively small city, grew explosively in part because it was close to rich salt mines in Michigan, providing vital salt for the emerging chemical industry and for food preservation. The discovery of petroleum in many regions was often associated with salt deposits, since salt geological formations create ideal conditions for hydrocarbon trapping. Engineers drilling for salt sometimes found petroleum, and vice versa. This geological connection meant that the development of the petroleum industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries frequently occurred in regions that already had developed infrastructure for salt extraction. The two industries complemented and drove each other forward. Mechanical refrigeration, gradually developed throughout the 19th century, began to compete with salting as a method of food preservation. The first refrigeration systems were large, expensive, and unreliable, but they represented the future. It would still take decades until refrigerators became common in homes, but the trend was established. For the first time in millennia, humanity would have a real alternative to salt for preserving perishable foods. This would have profound implications for salt's strategic value. But curiously, even as its importance in food preservation began to decline, salt found new industrial uses that would maintain its economic relevance. The explosively growing chemical industry discovered that salt was an essential raw material for producing countless substances. Chlorine and sodium hydroxide, caustic soda, both derived from salt through electrolysis, became fundamental to manufacturing paper, soap, glass, textiles, and hundreds of other products. Salt was transforming from a consumer commodity into an industrial commodity. The production of sodium carbonate, essential for glass and soap manufacturing, depended on salt as the main input. The Leblanc process, developed in the late 18th century, and later the more efficient Solvay process, revolutionized sodium carbonate production and created massive demand for salt. Chemical factories consumed tons of salt daily. Regions with easy access to both salt and coal for energy became centers of the nascent chemical industry, including areas in Germany, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. With massive industrial production, salt prices began to fall drastically. What once cost as much as gold was now affordable even for the poorest. State monopolies began to lose their control power as multiple production sources emerged, and efficient transportation created truly competitive markets. Some governments still tried to maintain taxes on salt, but the economic and political pressure to reduce or eliminate them grew constantly. Salt was democratizing, becoming a universal right instead of a privilege. This democratization of salt, seen in retrospect, seems inevitable, but it represented a profound change in social and economic organization. Resources that for millennia had been rigidly controlled as tools of state power were becoming common commodities in free markets. It was part of a larger transition from pre-industrial controlled economy to capitalist market economy. Salt was just one example, but an especially symbolic one, given its central historical importance in human life. Can you think of other technologies or resources that went through similar transitions? Information, for example, once rigidly controlled by governments and elites, now flows freely over the internet, at least in open societies. Renewable energy is beginning to decentralize electricity production. Distributed manufacturing through 3D printing may eventually democratize object production. The history of salt offers us a model. Technology and efficient distribution can transform scarce and strategic resources into abundant and accessible commodities. But this abundance did not come without new challenges, especially in the increasingly creative uses that humanity would find for this ancient mineral. The Industrial Revolution transformed practically every aspect of human life, and salt was no exception. For millennia, salt production had been limited by essentially primitive technologies: solar evaporation dependent on climate, labor-intensive manual mining, slow and inefficient processes. But between the 18th and 19th centuries, a wave of technological innovations began to radically transform how salt was extracted, processed, and distributed. The ultimate result would be the transformation of salt from a precious and strategically controlled commodity into a cheap and universally available product. One of the first important innovations came, curiously, from Switzerland, a landlocked country, but with rich salt germ mines in the Alps. In 1696, Swiss engineers developed techniques for dissolving underground rock salt by pumping hot water into deep salt deposits, creating concentrated brine that was then pumped to the surface and evaporated in controlled facilities. This method of solution mining was much more efficient and safer than sending men to dangerous depths with pickaxes. The technique gradually spread to other regions with rock salt deposits. The steam engine, that transformative force of the Industrial Revolution, also revolutionized salt production. Steam pumps allowed extraction of brine from previously inaccessible depths. Steam evaporation systems using large metal pans heated by furnaces fueled by coal allowed industrial-scale production independent of weather conditions. It was no longer necessary to wait for summer sun to evaporate salt. Production could occur year-round, in any climate. This dramatically increased available supply and began to pressure prices downward. In Victorian England, the salt mines of Cheshire became one of the most important production centres in the world. The region had vast rock salt deposits relatively close to the surface. With the application of industrial technology, including mechanized mining equipment, steam pumping systems, and railroads for efficient transport, Cheshire began producing millions of tons of salt annually. Cities like Northwich transformed into industrial centers dedicated almost exclusively to salt, with countless chimneys expelling smoke from processing facilities day and night. But this industrialization had environmental and social costs. Massive salt extraction frequently caused land subsidence, with entire areas sinking as salt caverns were excavated below. In Northwich, buildings regularly developed severe cracks or even collapsed completely. Some structures had to be built on floating foundations that could adjust as the ground sank. It was like living on a semi-liquid, unstable surface, constantly changing. The price of progress was, literally, having the earth move beneath your feet. Workers in industrialized mines faced new dangers. Powerful machines could crush, cut, or trap limbs in seconds of distraction. Explosions of methane gas or salt dust became more likely with larger-scale operations. Fatal accidents were surprisingly common but rarely properly recorded, especially when victims were common workers without resources to seek compensation. Salt continued to be extracted with blood, just now more efficiently and in much larger volumes. Simultaneously, innovations in transportation revolutionized salt distribution. Canals were built specifically to transport salt from mines and salt works to distant markets. The Bridgewater Canal in England, built in 1761, was one of the first modern industrial canals and was designed especially to transport coal and salt. Barges loaded with tons of salt glided smoothly through the canals, initially moved by horses and later by steamboats, drastically reducing transportation costs. What once took weeks in carts now took days on canals. The arrival of railroads completed the revolution in transportation. Train cars could carry quantities of salt that would make ancient camel caravans seem insignificant. A single train consisted of more salt than hundreds of carts, and it did so at unthinkable speeds before. What took weeks now took hours. Suddenly, salt from Cheshire mines could reach London the same day. American salt from New York mines could reach any city served by the growing national railroad network. Geography ceased to be a significant barrier. In the United States, the discovery of vast salt deposits drove the development of entire regions. The salt mines of Hutchinson, Kansas, eventually became some of the largest in the world, with underground caverns so vast that today they are used for storing everything from old Hollywood films to sensitive government documents. Detroit, once a relatively small city, grew explosively in part because it was close to rich salt mines in Michigan, providing vital salt for the emerging chemical industry and for food preservation. The discovery of petroleum in many regions was often associated with salt deposits, since salt geological formations create ideal conditions for hydrocarbon trapping. Engineers drilling for salt sometimes found petroleum, and vice versa. This geological connection meant that the development of the petroleum industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries frequently occurred in regions that already had developed infrastructure for salt extraction. The two industries complemented and drove each other forward. Mechanical refrigeration, gradually developed throughout the 19th century, began to compete with salting as a method of food preservation. The first refrigeration systems were large, expensive, and unreliable, but they represented the future. It would still take decades until refrigerators became common in homes, but the trend was established. For the first time in millennia, humanity would have a real alternative to salt for preserving perishable foods. This would have profound implications for salt's strategic value. But curiously, even as its importance in food preservation began to decline, salt found new industrial uses that would maintain its economic relevance. The explosively growing chemical industry discovered that salt was an essential raw material for producing countless substances. Chlorine and sodium hydroxide, caustic soda, both derived from salt through electrolysis, became fundamental to manufacturing paper, soap, glass, textiles, and hundreds of other products. Salt was transforming from a consumer commodity into an industrial commodity. The production of sodium carbonate, essential for glass and soap manufacturing, depended on salt as the main input. The Leblanc process, developed in the late 18th century, and later the more efficient Solvay process, revolutionized sodium carbonate production and created massive demand for salt. Chemical factories consumed tons of salt daily. Regions with easy access to both salt and coal for energy became centers of the nascent chemical industry, including areas in Germany, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. With massive industrial production, salt prices began to fall drastically. What once cost as much as gold was now affordable even for the poorest. State monopolies began to lose their control power as multiple production sources emerged, and efficient transportation created truly competitive markets. Some governments still tried to maintain taxes on salt, but the economic and political pressure to reduce or eliminate them grew constantly. Salt was democratizing, becoming a universal right instead of a privilege. This democratization of salt, seen in retrospect, seems inevitable, but it represented a profound change in social and economic organization. Resources that for millennia had been rigidly controlled as tools of state power were becoming common commodities in free markets. It was part of a larger transition from pre-industrial controlled economy to capitalist market economy. Salt was just one example, but an especially symbolic one, given its central historical importance in human life. Can you think of other technologies or resources that went through similar transitions? Information, for example, once rigidly controlled by governments and elites, now flows freely over the internet, at least in open societies. Renewable energy is beginning to decentralize electricity production. Distributed manufacturing through 3D printing may eventually democratize object production. The history of salt offers us a model. Technology and efficient distribution can transform scarce and strategic resources into abundant and accessible commodities. But this abundance did not come without new challenges, especially in the increasingly creative uses that humanity would find for this ancient mineral. If you think of salt only as the white powder that sits in a shaker on your dining table, prepare yourself for a surprise. Modern salt is one of the most versatile and widely used substances in practically every aspect of contemporary industrial and technological life. In fact, only a small fraction of globally produced salt is destined for direct human consumption. Most of it is consumed by industries that you probably don't even imagine have any connection to this simple mineral. Let's start with the chemical industry, the single largest consumer of salt in the modern world. Through a process called brine electrolysis, sodium chloride, salt, is electrically decomposed into its constituent elements, chlorine gas and metallic sodium, plus sodium hydroxide as a byproduct. These three substances are fundamental to modern manufacturing. Have you ever wondered where these so widely used chemical elements originate? The answer, frequently, is common salt. Chlorine derived from salt is used to disinfect drinking water, protecting billions of people from waterborne diseases. It is also an essential component in the production of PVC, polyvinyl chloride, one of the most widely used plastics in the world, present in plumbing pipes, coatings, toys, credit cards, and countless other products. Pesticides, solvents, even some medications depend on chlorinated compounds derived ultimately from salt. It's hard to overstate how fundamental chlorine is to modern industrial society, and all that chlorine starts as salt. Sodium hydroxide, also known as caustic soda, is another incredibly versatile substance derived from salt. It is used in paper manufacturing, where it helps break down the lignin that holds cellulose fibers together in wood. Soaps and detergents depend on caustic soda in their production process. The aluminum industry uses massive quantities of caustic soda to extract aluminum from its ore, bauxite. Food processing, petroleum purification, textile treatment, biodiesel production, all these processes depend on sodium hydroxide, that, again, originates from salt. Metallic sodium, although used in smaller quantities than chlorine and sodium hydroxide, also has important applications. It is used in some sodium vapor lamps, those that emit characteristic yellowish light, and are common in public lighting. It is also used as a coolant in some types of nuclear reactors and in specialized chemical syntheses. Even explosives and propellants for space missions have at some point used compounds derived from sodium that begins as salt. But let's move out of chemical industries and explore more everyday and surprising uses. In winter, in regions with temperate and cold climates, millions of tons of salt are spread on roads to melt ice and snow. The principle is simple but elegant. Dissolved salt in water reduces the freezing point of the resulting solution. Pure water freezes at 0 degrees C, but brine can remain liquid down to about 21 degrees C depending on concentration. This means that spreading salt on ice causes immediate melting, as long as it's not extremely cold, transforming dangerous and slippery surfaces into safe asphalt for traffic. The United States, Canada, and Northern European countries use truly astronomical quantities of salt for this purpose. Estimates suggest that the US alone applies about 20 million tons of salt on roads annually. Municipalities maintain immense stockpiles of salt stored in special depots prepared for each winter. Specially equipped trucks with spreaders travel roads during snowstorms, constantly throwing salt. It's a massive logistical operation, and without it, much of economic life in cold regions would simply stop during winter months. This massive application of salt on roads is not without environmental consequences. Salt runs off into soil alongside roads, increasing salinity and affecting vegetation. Plants that are not salt-tolerant die, creating bands of dead or weakened vegetation along roadsides. Salt also contaminates underground aquifers and surface bodies of water, affecting aquatic ecosystems, and it corrodes metal infrastructure. Bridges, overpasses, the very structure of vehicles, everything suffers from salt exposure. It's a calculated trade-off. The benefits of safety and mobility are considered greater than the environmental and maintenance costs, but it's a reminder that even seemingly benign uses of common substances have impacts. In the food industry, beyond the obvious use as seasoning and preservative, salt has sophisticated technical functions. In bread baking, salt controls the speed of yeast fermentation, strengthens the gluten network in bread, making the dough more elastic and able to retain gases, and contributes to golden crust formation. In cheese production, salt not only adds flavor, but controls microbial growth, influences texture, and helps form the external rind. In processed meat production, salt extracts soluble proteins from meat that then act as binders, holding products like sausages and hams together. Salt also plays a crucial role in leather tanning. For centuries, animal hides were preserved and transformed into leather through processes that involved immersion in concentrated salt solutions. Although modern tanning methods often use more specialized chemical compounds, salt is still used in preliminary stages to preserve hides before complete processing and to remove excess moisture. The leather of the bag you carry or the shoes you wear probably passed through salt baths at some point in its manufacture. In the dye and textile industry, salt has traditionally been used as a mordant, a substance that helps dyes fix onto fabric fibers. When you dip fabric into a dye solution containing salt, dye molecules penetrate deeper into the fibers and bind more strongly, resulting in more vibrant and durable colors that resist washing better. Even with modern synthetic dyes, salt is still often used in this process. The bright colors of the clothes you wear owe part of their durability to salt. In medical applications, salt has uses that go far beyond putting a little on food. Saline solutions, water with salt at specific concentrations, are fundamental in modern medicine. Physiological saline, a 0.9% sodium chloride solution, is isotonic with human blood, meaning it has the same salt concentration. It is used for intravenous rehydration, wound cleaning, dilution of injectable medications, and countless other medical applications. Bags of physiological saline hanging on stands beside hospital beds are an iconic image of modern medicine, and all they contain is essentially carefully prepared salt water. Kidney dialysis, a vital procedure for people whose kidneys don't function properly, depends on carefully balanced solutions that include salt at the exact concentration. The patient's blood flows through a machine where it is separated from a dialysis solution by a semi-permeable membrane. Through osmosis and diffusion, toxins and excess fluids pass from the blood into the dialysis solution, while essential electrolytes, including sodium, are maintained in balance. The precise balancing of salt in these solutions is literally a matter of life and death. Even in oil exploration and production, salt plays important roles. Drilling fluids used during oil, well drilling to lubricate the drill bit, remove rock debris and maintain proper pressure, often contain salt. Additionally, underground salt deposits are utilized to store both petroleum and natural gas. Artificial caverns are excavated in rock salt formations, creating immense and hermetically sealed spaces, ideal for strategic storage of fuels. The United States' strategic petroleum reserves, for example, are stored in enormous salt caverns along the Gulf Coast. In the paper and pulp industry, salt participates in the kraft process, the most common method of cellulose pulp production. Sodium compounds derived from salt help break down lignin and other substances that bind cellulose fibers in wood. Although it's not the only method of paper production, the kraft process dominates the industry, meaning that much of the paper you use daily, from toilet paper to books and cardboard boxes, went through processes involving compounds derived from salt. Can you perceive the pattern? Salt is literally everywhere, invisible, but essential, permeating practically every aspect of modern life. It's a humble reminder that some of the most common and seemingly mundane substances are actually fundamental pillars of our technological civilization. But with this omnipresence comes also an important question. With so much salt being mined, processed, and utilized, where exactly does all this salt come from? And more importantly, could it run out? Look at a world map, and you are essentially looking at a giant map of salt sources, because salt is not a scarce resource in the conventional sense. It is, in fact, one of the most abundant and widely distributed minerals on Earth's surface. About 3% of the mass of the oceans is dissolved salt, representing approximately 50 billion tons of sodium chloride. To put that in perspective, if you could instantly evaporate all the world's oceans, the resulting layer of salt covering the ocean floors would be about 60 meters thick. It's hard to imagine the immensity of that quantity, but the oceans are not the only source of salt, nor even necessarily the most convenient for exploitation. Rock salt deposits formed by ancient seas that evaporated millions of years ago exist in vast regions of the world, buried at different depths beneath the Earth's surface. These deposits literally represent ancient oceans preserved in solid form. During past geological periods, shallow seas in tropical regions evaporated faster than they were replenished by rivers or adjacent oceans, concentrating salt until it precipitated at the bottom and formed thick layers that were then covered by later sediments. Some of the most impressive rock salt formations are incredibly thick. In the Gulf of Mexico, salt domes, mushroom-shaped structures formed when deep salt, being plastic under pressure, slowly flows upward through overlying rocks, can be thousands of meters tall. The Cura salt mine in Pakistan, one of the largest in the world, has tunnels extending more than 400 meters into the salt mountain and produces thousands of tons annually. Tourists who visit it describe entire underground cathedrals carved in crystalline salt, illuminated by chandeliers that make the crystals sparkle like diamonds. The Sifto mine in Canada beneath Lake Huron operates at depths of more than 500 meters below the water surface. Tunnels extend more than 7 kilometers from the access shaft, forming an underground salt city. Giant mining machines continuously excavate rock salt, which is then transported to the surface, processed and distributed. It's an operation that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, extracting a mineral that formed more than 400 million years ago when the region was covered by tropical seas. Modern salt mines are marvels of engineering and technology. Unlike the brutal manual operations of the past, contemporary mining is highly mechanized. Continuous mining machines, some the size of small houses, advance along salt walls, excavating and loading material onto continuous conveyors. Sophisticated ventilation systems maintain breathable air at depths. LED lighting transforms dark tunnels into surprisingly bright spaces. Yet still, there is something profoundly impressive and slightly unsettling about being hundreds of meters below the earth, surrounded by walls of salt, knowing that millions of tons of rock are suspended above your head. Solar evaporation salt works represent a completely different method of salt production, which essentially mimics and accelerates natural geological processes. In coastal regions with high solar radiation, low precipitation, and favorable geography, vast evaporation fields are constructed. Seawater is pumped into shallow, interconnected tanks. As sun and wind evaporate the water, salt concentration increases progressively. Water is moved from tank to tank, each stage increasing salinity until finally, in the final crystallization tanks, salt crystals begin to precipitate and cover the bottom. The San Francisco Bay Salt Works in California are an iconic example. Viewed from the air, they look like a giant artist's palette with tanks at different evaporation stages, showing colors ranging from green to intense pink and even purple, depending on salt concentration and the types of halophilic, salt-loving microorganisms that thrive at each salinity level. These surreal colors have transformed the salt works into a photographic attraction, although they are essentially open-air salt factories operating silently under the California sun. In Guérande, in France, traditional salt works operated by workers called paludiers still produce salt using artisanal methods dating back centuries. Guérande salt, especially fleur de sel, delicate crystals that form on the water's surface under ideal conditions, is considered a gourmet product, sold at premium prices in specialty shops. Each paludier cares for their own tanks, using knowledge transmitted through generations about when and how to harvest salt for maximum quality. It's a living tradition that directly connects the present to the past, a pre-industrial remnant surviving in the modern world. The Dead Sea, on the border between Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan, is one of the most naturally saline sources in the world. With salinity of about 34%, 10 times the average salinity of the ocean, its waters are so dense that human bodies float effortlessly. Industries on both shores extract not just sodium chloride, but also other valuable minerals like potassium, magnesium, and bromine from the concentrated brine. Ironically, this industrial exploitation, combined with diversion of water from rivers that feed the Dead Sea, is causing its level to drop dramatically, about 1 meter per year. This ancient sea may not survive the century if current trends continue. The Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia is the largest salt flat in the world, covering more than 10,000 square kilometers. During the dry season, it is a blinding white expanse of crystallized salt stretching to the horizon in all directions, creating one of the most surreal and photogenic landscapes on the planet. During the rainy season, a thin layer of water covers the salt, transforming the sailor into a giant mirror that perfectly reflects the sky, creating the illusion of walking on clouds. But beyond its surreal beauty, Uyuni contains about 10 billion tons of salt and, perhaps more importantly, some of the world's largest lithium reserves, essential for electric vehicle batteries and modern electronics. The Great Salt Lake in Utah in the United States, although much smaller than the Salar de Uyuni, is also an important source of salt and other minerals. Its salinity varies seasonally but can reach 27%, higher than that of the ocean. Industrial operations extract salt by evaporating lake water in large basins. Curiously, because the lake has no outlet, minerals concentrate in it over time, making it progressively more saline as fresh water evaporates, but minerals remain. Returning to the oceans, direct extraction of sea salt through solar evaporation continues to be an important production method in many parts of the world. Tropical and subtropical countries with long, dry seasons and suitable coasts have a natural advantage. India, China, Mexico, Australia, all produce millions of tons of sea salt annually through coastal salt works. The method is energy efficient, essentially using the sun as a free energy source, although it requires vast expanses of flat land near the sea. A fascinating question is, could the salt in the oceans ever run out? The short answer is no, at least not on any time scale relevant to human civilization. Even if we extracted millions of tons of salt per year from the oceans, which we already do, the total amount is so vast that it would barely be noticed. Rivers continuously transport dissolved minerals, including salt, from continental lands to the oceans, replenishing any loss. Geologically speaking, the oceans are salt recyclers. When shallow seas evaporate, forming rock salt deposits, these deposits are eventually uplifted, eroded, and their minerals return to the sea through rivers in a cycle that lasts millions of years. Therefore, salt is not a finite resource that we need to fear running out of, like petroleum or rare minerals. It is, in practice, infinitely renewable on human timescales. This raises an interesting question. If salt is so abundant, why was it valuable for so long? The answer, as we've already explored, was not in the absolute rarity of salt, but in the difficulty of extracting it, processing it, and transporting it to where it was needed. The value was not in the mineral itself, but in the human labor and technology required to make it accessible. This distinction between absolute scarcity and access scarcity is fundamental to understanding resource economics. Today, salt is so cheap that it is essentially free in relative terms. A kilogram of salt costs less than a coffee. You probably spend more on packaging and transportation than on the salt itself. This transformation from precious to mundane is one of the most dramatic economic narratives in history. But do we value salt less precisely because it has become so common? There is a philosophical lesson here about perceived value versus intrinsic value that resonates far beyond the economics of salt. There is a profound and almost cruel irony in modern humanity's relationship with salt. For millennia, salt was precious, pursued, fought over. Wars were waged for it, empires financed with it, populations controlled through it. Salt scarcity could mean death. And now doctors tell us that we probably consume too much salt, that salt is slowly killing us, raising our blood pressure, overloading our kidneys, contributing to cardiovascular disease. What changed? How did we go from never having enough salt to having too much? The answer, like many questions about modern health, lies in the radical transformation of our diet and lifestyle. For most of human evolutionary history, salt was genuinely scarce. Our bodies developed sophisticated mechanisms to conserve every precious milligram of sodium. Human kidneys are incredibly efficient at retaining sodium when they detect scarcity. We developed taste buds specifically to detect and enjoy salty flavor, encouraging us to seek out and consume salt when available. We evolved, essentially, in an environment of salt scarcity. But modern reality is radically different. Salt is in everything, not just in the shaker on your table, but hidden in surprising quantities in practically all processed foods. Bread, breakfast cereals, canned soups, sauces, processed meats, cheeses, snacks, ready-made meals, fast food, even in seemingly innocent items like ice cream and sweet-baked goods. The food industry uses salt not just for flavor, but also as a preservative, texturizer, color enhancer, and flavor potentiator. It's cheap and extremely effective in all these functions. The result is that average sodium consumption in most developed countries is well above public health recommendations. The World Health Organization recommends maximum sodium consumption of 2 grams per day, equivalent to about 5 grams of table salt. Studies indicate that average consumption in the United States is close to 3.5 grams of sodium per day, almost double the recommendation. In some Asian countries where soy sauce and salty fermented foods are dietary staples, consumption can be even higher. The main problem with excess sodium is its effect on blood pressure. Sodium retains water in the body, increasing the total volume of fluid circulating in the cardiovascular system. This forces the heart to work harder to pump this additional volume and increases the pressure exerted against artery walls. Over time, this elevated pressure damages artery walls, contributing to atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, drastically increasing the risk of heart attacks, strokes, heart failure, and chronic kidney disease. High blood pressure, hypertension, is often called the silent killer because it usually doesn't cause obvious symptoms until significant damage has already occurred. It's estimated that more than 1 billion people worldwide have hypertension, and excess dietary sodium is one of the main modifiable contributing factors. Population studies demonstrate clear correlation between average salt consumption and prevalence of hypertension in populations. Countries with traditionally salt-rich diets show higher rates of hypertension and related cardiovascular diseases. But the story is more complex than simply salt is bad. Individual response to sodium varies significantly among people. Some individuals are salt-sensitive, meaning their blood pressure responds dramatically to changes in sodium consumption. Others are salt-resistant, showing little or no change in blood pressure with variations in sodium consumption. This variability has genetic bases, and research is still unraveling the exact mechanisms. But since there's no simple and accessible test to determine individual salt sensitivity, public health recommendations necessarily treat everyone with the same guidance to moderate consumption. Beyond cardiovascular effects, excess sodium also affects the kidneys. Kidneys are responsible for filtering excess sodium from the blood and excreting it in urine. Chronically high sodium diets force kidneys to work harder to maintain balance. Over time, especially in individuals with other risk factors like diabetes or pre-existing kidney disease, this overload can contribute to declining kidney function. Chronic kidney disease, in turn, makes it even harder to regulate sodium, creating a vicious cycle. There is also growing evidence linking high sodium consumption to other health problems beyond the cardiovascular system. Some studies suggest a connection between salt-rich diets and increased risk of certain types of cancer, particularly stomach cancer. The proposed mechanism is that salt in high concentrations can damage the stomach lining, making it more vulnerable to infection by Helicobacter pylori, bacteria associated with ulcers and stomach cancer, and effects of carcinogenic compounds. Other studies investigate possible links between high salt consumption and osteoporosis, as excess sodium increases urinary calcium excretion. But reducing salt consumption in modern societies is surprisingly difficult. Remember, we mentioned that most of the salt we consume is hidden in processed foods. This means that simply removing the salt shaker from the table has minimal impact. Studies estimate that about 75% of dietary sodium in Western countries comes from processed foods and restaurant meals, not from salt added during cooking or at the table. To truly reduce sodium consumption would require fundamental change in how we shop for and prepare food. The food industry argues that reducing salt in processed products significantly affects flavor, texture, and shelf life, and that consumers won't accept lower salt products. There's some truth to this. People accustomed to high salt levels find lower salt food bland and flavorless initially, but studies also show that salt preferences are adaptable. If you gradually reduce salt in your diet over a few weeks, your taste buds adjust, and you begin to appreciate more subtle flavors that were previously masked by salt. Food that once seemed perfectly salty now seems excessively salty. It's a sensory recalibration. Some countries have implemented public health initiatives to reduce population-level salt consumption. Finland, for example, launched a national campaign in the 1970s that included public education, clear labeling of salt content in foods, and cooperation with the food industry to reformulate products with less salt. Over decades, average salt consumption dropped significantly, accompanied by dramatic decline in mortality from cardiovascular disease. It was one of the most impressive success stories in preventive public health. The United Kingdom also implemented a successful salt reduction program, working with food manufacturers to gradually reduce salt content in specific product categories. The reduction was so gradual that consumers didn't notice flavor changes, but the cumulative effect was significant reduction in population sodium consumption. These examples demonstrate that change is possible when there is political will and cooperation between governments, industry, and the public. But there is an additional paradox to consider. While excess salt is a problem in developed countries with abundant access to processed foods, iodine deficiency remains a significant public health problem in parts of the developing world. Iodine, essential for thyroid function, is not naturally abundant in many soils and water sources. Iodized salt, salt to which small amounts of iodine are added, has been one of the most successful public health interventions of the 20th century, virtually eliminating goiter, thyroid enlargement from iodine deficiency, and cretinism, severe mental deficiency caused by iodine deficiency during pregnancy, in countries that implemented salt iodization programs. Therefore, salt is simultaneously a public health problem when consumed in excess, and a public health solution as a vehicle for iodine. It is savior and villain, essential and dangerous, all depending on context and quantity. This duality is disconcerting but instructive. It reminds us that there are rarely simple answers in nutrition and health. Context, dose, and individuality matter enormously. Salt is not intrinsically good or bad. Our relationship with it, shaped by evolution, history, technology, and culture, is what determines whether it benefits or harms us. Have you ever stopped to think about how many other substances in our lives have this same duality? Water is essential, but you can die from water intoxication if you drink an extreme amount. Oxygen keeps you alive, but pure oxygen at high concentrations is toxic. Even vitamins, when consumed in megadoses, can cause serious problems. Perhaps the deepest lesson of salt is this: virtually everything in biology and medicine is a matter of balance. Too little is bad, too much is bad, and the ideal zone in between is often narrow and specific to each individual. Salt, with its history of scarcity transformed into abundance, is the perfect teacher of this fundamental lesson. As the 21st century advances, salt finds itself in a peculiar position. It is simultaneously one of the oldest known and used substances by humanity and a critical component of cutting-edge technologies. It is so cheap it is practically free, yet specialized applications can command premium prices. It is abundantly beyond imagination, yet its distribution and use raise increasingly urgent environmental and health questions. What is the future of salt? How does this ancient substance fit into the world we are building? One of the most interesting emerging applications of salt is in energy storage. As the world attempts to transition to renewable energy sources like solar and wind, a fundamental challenge is storage. How do you store energy generated during periods of sun and wind for use when the sun sets and the wind ceases? Lithium-ion batteries, currently dominant, are expensive and have scaling limitations. A promising alternative under development is molten salt batteries. These batteries use sodium derived from salt instead of lithium and operate at elevated temperatures where salt is in molten state, allowing rapid ion flow and high storage capacity. Sodium-sulfur batteries and sodium-air batteries are being developed by companies and research laboratories globally. Sodium has significant advantages over lithium. It is immensely more abundant, derived essentially from salt, which is unlimited, much cheaper, and less geopolitically problematic. It's not concentrated in a few countries like lithium. If these technologies can be commercialized effectively, salt literally becomes the foundation of energy storage for the transition to a low-carbon economy. Who could have predicted that ancient salt would become key to the energetic future? Another fascinating application is in thermal energy storage. Some concentrated solar power plants use molten salt, a mixture of sodium nitrate and potassium nitrate, as a heat storage medium. During the day, mirrors concentrate sunlight to heat salt to temperatures above 500 degrees Celsius. This hot molten salt is stored in insulated tanks. When needed, the hot salt is pumped through heat exchangers to produce steam that drives generator turbines producing electricity. This allows the solar plant to continue generating electricity at night or on cloudy days, overcoming one of the main limitations of solar energy. In agriculture, salt continues to play an important role, but now also as a challenge. Soil salinization is a growing problem in many regions of the world, especially in areas with intensive irrigation in arid climates. When water is applied to fields, it eventually evaporates or is absorbed by plants, but dissolved minerals, including salts, remain in the soil. Over time, these salts accumulate to concentrations that become toxic to most cultivated plants. Vast areas of productive agricultural land have been lost to salinization, a process some compare to chemical desertification. Researchers are working on various approaches to combat salinization. Development of salt-tolerant crops through conventional breeding and genetic engineering is one strategy. If we could cultivate wheat, rice, or corn that thrived in moderately saline soils, millions of hectares of degraded land could return to production. Another approach is to improve irrigation management practices to minimize salt accumulation, including use of drainage systems that remove salty water before salts concentrate dangerously. In aquaculture, salt plays a fundamental role that many people don't realize. Farming fish and shrimp in salt water or brackish tanks requires careful management of salinity. Adding salt, usually unrefined sea salt, to freshwater tanks can help reduce stress in fish, combat parasites and diseases, and in some cases improve growth. As aquaculture continues growing as a global protein source, sophisticated understanding of how to use salt in aquatic health management becomes increasingly important. The salt industry itself is becoming more sophisticated and segmented. While industrial-grade commodity salt remains extremely cheap, market niches for specialty salts are growing. Fleur de sel from specific regions, Himalayan salt, that pink salt in every natural product store, although geologically it's from Pakistan, not the Himalayas, black lava salt from Hawaii, smoked salt, salt infused with spices, all command prices that would make a medieval salt miner think he's dreaming. It's a kind of artisanalization of salt, where history, terroir, a concept borrowed from wine, meaning unique characteristics given by geography and production method, and marketing create perceived value far beyond mineral content. There is interesting debate in the culinary and health community about whether different types of salt have genuinely different nutritional or flavor properties. Chemically, all are primarily sodium chloride, but unrefined salts contain traces of other minerals that may subtly contribute to flavor and, in theory, to nutrition. Unrefined sea salt contains small amounts of magnesium, calcium, potassium, and various trace elements. Pink Himalayan salt contains traces of iron oxide, which gives the pink color, and other minerals. Advocates argue that these additional minerals make a difference. Skeptics point out that the amounts are so tiny that nutritional impact is insignificant. Probably the truth is in the middle. There are subtle flavor differences due to trace minerals, but nutritional benefits are probably exaggerated. In water desalination technology, salt is simultaneously the problem and potentially part of the solution. More than 2 billion people live in regions with water scarcity, and seawater desalination is increasingly seen as a necessary solution. But desalination is energy-intensive, and the resulting salt concentrate, rejected brine, needs to be disposed of, usually back into the ocean, where it can create zones of elevated salinity harmful to marine life. Researchers are exploring ways to make desalination more energy efficient and to find productive uses for concentrated brine rather than simply discarding it. An interesting proposal is to extract valuable minerals from desalination brine. Beyond sodium chloride, the brine contains magnesium, lithium, bromine, and other elements that could be economically viable to extract if processes were perfected. Transforming a problematic waste product into a source of valuable minerals would be a perfect example of circular economy, where waste becomes resources. In the context of climate change, salt also appears in discussions about geoengineering. Some proposals involve dispersing saltwater droplets in the atmosphere over oceans to increase the albedo reflectivity of clouds, reflecting more sunlight back to space and thus cooling the planet. This marine cloud brightening is highly speculative and controversial, with many unanswered questions about effectiveness, side effects, and governance. But the fact that salt appears even in futuristic discussions about planetary climate manipulation demonstrates how fundamental and versatile this substance remains. As the global population continues growing and urbanizing, demand for salt in its multiple forms will continue increasing. Salt for the chemical industry, for processed foods, for winter roads, for agriculture and aquaculture, for emerging energy technologies. Fortunately, as we discussed, salt is not a resource we will face scarcity of, but questions around how we use salt, especially in foods, will continue to be central to public health debates, and industrial applications of salt will continue evolving as technology advances. There is something poetically appropriate about the fact that salt, one of the first substances humanity learned to value, extract, and trade, remains fundamentally important at the technological frontiers of the 21st century. How many other technologies or materials from 5,000 years ago are still fundamentally important today? Not many. Wheel, fire, salt, perhaps a few others. That speaks to how profoundly fundamental salt is to human existence and to the technological systems we build. But this same ubiquity and importance also means we have responsibility. Responsibility to use salt wisely in our individual diets, balancing biological necessity with the risks of excess. Responsibility to extract and produce salt in environmentally sustainable and socially just ways. Responsibility to innovate to find new uses that help solve global challenges like energy storage and water scarcity. Salt has connected our past, permeates our present, and will be part of our future. The question is, what kind of relationship will we have with this ancient substance as we build the world to come? We have reached the end of a long journey through time and geography, a journey measured not in kilometers, but in grains of salt. We departed from the dawn of human civilization, when salt was as rare and precious as gems, traversed empires built on salt routes and fortunes made in white crystals, witnessed suffering and oppression linked to this essential mineral, observed the technological transformation that democratized access to salt, and finally arrived at the present and future, where salt is simultaneously abundant and problematic, ancient and innovative. If you paid attention to this narrative, you should be looking at the salt on your table in a completely different way now. That small container, perhaps decorative, perhaps purely functional, contains not just sodium chloride, but concentrated history. Every grain is a reminder of caravans crossing deserts under scorching sun, of miners in dark tunnels hundreds of meters beneath the earth, of popular revolts against oppressive taxes, of technological advances that transformed entire economies. You hold, literally, human history at your fingertips every time you season your food. But beyond the history, there are deeper lessons here. The history of salt teaches us about value and how it is socially constructed, not intrinsic. Salt hasn't changed. It is exactly the same chemical compound today as it was 5,000 years ago. What changed was our ability to obtain it, process it, and distribute it. Value, we discovered, is not in things themselves, but in their relative accessibility and the narratives we construct around them. Diamonds are not intrinsically more valuable than salt. They simply remain harder to obtain, and we cultivate entire cultures of meaning around them. The history of salt also teaches us about power. Control over essential resources is control over people. Governments understood this millennia ago and built elaborate systems of taxation and monopoly over salt, specifically because people could not live without it. This lesson resonates powerfully today. What are the modern salts? Personal data, internet access, energy? Who controls these essential resources of contemporary life, and is that control exercised fairly and transparently? Historical struggles over salt are mirrors for understanding power dynamics that continue today in different forms. There is also a lesson about unintended consequences. For millennia, scarce salt was a problem humanity struggled to solve. And then we solved it so completely that we created the opposite problem: excessive abundance leading to widespread health problems. How many times do we do this? Solve a problem so well that we create new problems in the process. The Green Revolution solved massive hunger through intensive agriculture, but created dependence on chemical pesticides and fertilizers with significant environmental impacts. Antibiotics saved millions of lives, but overuse is creating threatening antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The pattern repeats. The solution, as is often the case, is not simple reversal, but informed balance and careful management. We cannot and do not want to return to a world where salt is scarce and precious. But we can be more conscious about how much we use, especially in processed foods. We can pressure for product reformulation to reduce sodium content without sacrificing food safety. We can educate about reading nutrition labels and making informed choices. It's about navigating intelligently between past scarcity and present abundance. The history of salt also reminds us of our global interconnectedness. Salt traveled farther than most people throughout history. Salt trade routes connected civilizations, disseminated ideas, mixed cultures. The salt you use may have come from mines in Canada, salt works in California, deposits in Pakistan, or salt ponds in France. We live in a network of global trade and production so dense and complex that we rarely think about the origin of the most everyday things. Salt reminds us that this globalization is not new, only its scale and speed have changed. There is also a philosophical and even spiritual dimension to the history of salt that we cannot ignore. Many cultures around the world consider salt sacred or symbolic. In religious traditions, salt represents purification, preservation, covenant. Salt of the earth is a biblical expression meaning people of genuine and essential value. Sharing salt with someone creates a bond of hospitality and trust in many cultures. Why did salt acquire these meanings? Probably because, at a fundamental level, salt represents survival, the preservation of life against deterioration. It is a powerful symbol of resistance against entropy, against forgetting, against death. And perhaps that is what makes the history of salt so universally resonant. It is ultimately a story about human survival and ingenuity, about how our species identified a fundamental biological need and then spent millennia developing increasingly sophisticated technologies to satisfy it. From the first simple salt works to the complex modern chemical industrial complexes that process millions of tons of salt annually. The trajectory is one of increasing mastery over our environment and resources. But this mastery comes with responsibility. We are now so powerful in our ability to extract, process, and utilize resources like salt that we must think carefully about long-term impacts. Salinization of agricultural soils, disposal of desalination brine, environmental impacts of spreading millions of tons of salt on roads, exploitation of workers in salt works in poor countries, public health problems from excess dietary sodium. All these are consequences of our power over salt. Recognizing these consequences and working to mitigate them is part of maturing as a species. When you add a pinch of salt to your next meal, I invite you to pause for a moment. Not a long pause. I'm not suggesting we transform every meal into historical meditation, just a brief moment of acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that that simple, almost unconscious act is supported by layers upon layers of human history, labor, technology, trade, and knowledge. That you are participating in a ritual as ancient as civilization itself, an act that connects you to every human who ever lived and sought to make food more flavorful, and preserve nutrition against deterioration. And perhaps with that acknowledgement comes also a quiet gratitude for the abundance we enjoy and for the invisible network of people and systems that make it possible. Gratitude combined with awareness that abundance is not guaranteed, that it requires maintenance, that it benefits from wisdom in use, and that it should be shared equitably. Salt teaches us all this if we are willing to listen to the stories contained in its crystals. The journey of salt from precious to common is in many ways the journey of modernity itself. It is a story of democratization, of technology, making available to all what was the luxury of few. It is a satisfying narrative in many respects, but it also reminds us that democratization of access brings its own challenges. More is not always better. Sometimes abundance requires the wisdom of moderation. So as you drift to sleep tonight, cradled by this long narrative about a simple mineral, carry with you this reflection. Value is not fixed, but contextual. Power over essential resources is responsibility, not just privilege. Technology solves problems but creates new ones. Balance is often wiser than extremes, and sometimes the deepest and most instructive stories are hidden in the most common and neglected things around us. We just need to have the curiosity to ask, the patience to learn, and the humility to recognize that there is still much we do not know. Good night. May your dreams be seasoned with the wisdom of centuries, preserved against forgetting, and perhaps just slightly salted by tears of gratitude for all that we have and often take for granted. Salt has taught its final lesson for today. The extraordinary lives disguised in the ordinary, waiting only for us to pay attention.